Let's see if I present.
And here we are. So a little music to get us going.
The Guyana Business Journal and the Caribbean Policy Consortium presents Transforming Guyana. In each episode, Dr. Blackman and Dr. Lewis will tackle a different area of interest for transforming Guyana.
Good morning, colleagues, and welcome to Season 2, Episode 1 of the Guyana Business Journal and the Caribbean Policy Consortium webinar series, Transforming Guyana. I am Terrence Blackman, Associate Professor of Mathematics at Medgar Evers College in the City University of New York, and the founder of the Guyana Business Journal. I'm joined today by Dr. Riyad Insanali as my co-host, former Guyanese ambassador to the United States and fellow of the Caribbean Policy Consortium. As is always, it's a good thing to first kind of lay out, in a sense, the GBJ's vision. So we intend to be a place where one can find innovative and practical recommendations that advance three broad goals. One, strengthening the Guyanese democracy. Two, fostering economic opportunity, social welfare, and security for all Guyanese. And three, catalyzing a secure and open, safe, prosperous, and cohesive Guyana in which all Guyanese, irrespective of race, class, ethnicity, or religious persuasion, share equally in the economic prosperity of Guyana. This series brings together experts and prominent voices from Guyana, the Caribbean, and the diaspora to discuss the impacts of Guyana's oil and gas development. We aim to offer a nuanced look at opportunities and potential pitfalls ahead for Guyana, and we explore strategies to maximize the positive impacts of oil revenues can have on Guyana's people in the future while mitigating the risks that other countries have faced. And also, we would like to identify the sort of promising roles that the diaspora can play in this transition. Having kind of given you a brief, so to speak, of what we're aiming at doing, I want to invite my co-host, Dr. Riyad Insanali, to say a few words of welcome on behalf of the Caribbean Policy Consortium. Dr. Insanali.
Thanks very much, Terrence. Good morning, everyone. I am actually filling in for Dr. David Lewis, but I'm pleased as a member of the Caribbean Policy Consortium that I've been asked. This conversation is one that has been going on for some time, promoted by the Guyana Business Journal and the Caribbean Policy Consortium. And in trying to address some of the issues that Guyana is facing in this transformative period, the focus has obviously been, for the most part, on engaging the diaspora, but I am well aware that we have an audience that includes people at home in Guyana and in the region. And indeed, our panelists today are not from the diaspora, are not even from Guyana. We have Dr. Roger Hussain, an economist at the University of the West Indies in Trinidad and Tobago, with a special interest in international trade and the Dutch disease, and Dr. Remy Piet, who is based in Miami, who is also an economist with expertise in political economy, sustainable development of natural resources, and ESG. I think with our focus today on revenue sharing in the oil and gas economy, we have two very relevant perspectives to bring to bear. And without further ado, I'm going to invite our panelists to get into the debate, as it is. Perhaps Dr. P.A. Remy looking at things from the global perspective, and Dr. Hussain looking at things from the regional perspective, with a particular focus on the lessons that could be learned from the Trinidad and Tobago experience. Gentlemen, you have 12 minutes each. I will try to keep you to the clock, but Remy, over to you. Thank you.
Oh, perfect. Thank you very much. First of all, thank you for the invitation for the Roy Terrence and Riyadh, and saying hi to David also. No, great opportunity to discuss Guyana and questions of revenue sharing. It's very important. You mentioned the role of diaspora to pass the information, because we believe that the key to the future development of Guyana also is in the hands of the diaspora. The initiative that you put together, Terrence, is also very interesting. In your presentation of the program, we're going to be talking about revenue sharing, but there's a lot afterwards that will follow in terms of trying to see fair transition in the economy and the society of Guyana, and working with communities, or looking at sustainability of different models. And I use that in the last slide of this presentation. And thank you for sharing it. So very maybe quickly here, I'm no Guyana, for having traveled there and worked there quite some times. I did my PhD in the University of Miami, where Guyana was a key focus, obviously, but I'm French traditionally. We built a company also called Ambili. That's why you see Ambili on these slides. But if you want to go on the next slide, thank you very much, Terrence. I didn't know you were actually handling the slide, but that's very interesting. So very quickly, that's Ambili in different. We have offices in Miami, so we have a perspective of different countries, and it's very interesting to discuss the case of Guyana in comparative studies. And we have, Roger's going to talk about Trinidad and Tobago. He's going to be able to give some clear understanding of the difference between the two countries. But there's different schemes of revenue sharings between different countries and different regions. Go on the next slide, sorry, very quickly, and jump. I don't know if I can do it myself, by the way. That might be easier. Well, I can. Sorry for that. So, sorry for that, Terrence. I appreciate it. I didn't know I can do it. Thank you for this, your help. So on the revenue sharing, going directly there, sorry. So when we're looking at revenue sharing, the idea is to try to see what constitutes the revenue sharing. I'm talking about, most to students. I know some of them are following on this webinar. The idea is to understand that the revenue sharing is a series of different components. There's obviously the licensing fees, signature of bonuses and licenses fee for exploration in all different companies that try to apply for a license. The royalties are central in terms of the percentage of the value of the extracted resources that can be shared with local communities and local countries. In the case of Guyana, there's obviously different structure of royalties. You have the old royalties of 2% and ramped up to 10%. I'm sure Roger will be able to give you much more details in terms of Guyana and in comparison with Trinidad. So I'm trying to keep more at the macro level and set the stage. There's also elements of taxation. In the case of taxation, you have the elements of imposition of different taxes to share revenues from all activities. And that includes CIT, the VAT, also on different services, import duties. And what we're looking, and probably will be more interesting and spending a little more time on this, are elements of production sharing contracts, community development agreements, and equity participation. So this is, the first three were more traditional macro elements of taxation, royalties, and license fares. But then what the true value is the fact that the financial element of the revenue sharing structure is just one of those elements. There's other elements that should be taken in care in count, such as having contracts of production sharing. So those are the agreements between the oil companies and the governments, where the companies bear the exploration and production costs, but in return share the revenue. So how do you disperse those revenues? I go into this into the next slide, but also how do you actually work in terms of building long-term partnership towards building the business ecosystem and trying to have not only trust and sovereign wealth funds and financial funds, but also having the structure and the capacity to develop ecosystem, build on entrepreneurship, support it. And that's why you have sometimes, the next step, which is the community development agreements, where you outline the benefits and responsibilities of different parties, include provision for revenue sharing, but also looking at infrastructure development, employment opportunities, environmental protection. So understanding the funding also, in some cases in Guyana, the mining sector has had some best case practices in supporting, and in the Guyanas more generally, supporting some regulations. It is the case also in Guyana in oil sector in terms of some of the regulations. But the idea and key opportunities into employment opportunities, training, participation and protection in terms of ESG. And when you continue further along, and there's examples such as in Canada, Guyana, such as the Project Reconciliation. We did a recent webinars on those community participation in the energy sector. I'm happy to refer to it in the future. But we look at actually equity participation of the government of holding equity stakes in joint venture or through the operation of national oil companies. So that's the different structure that you have in terms of, from more kind of cut taxation licensing fees to more ambitious schemes of being an equity partner. I'm not going to go into details in terms of Guyana. I'm sure Roger was about to go there. Maybe if not in the questions, I'd be more than happy to address the particularities of Guyana. I'd like to move forward and trying to see what it means for government and stakeholders. And because the only question that is very interesting for all of us here, academics and practitioners, in terms of translating and trickling oil findings into sustainable development, is to try to go from oil to development, dark oil to development, green development. That's where you have to agree on the next schemes and the best best practices that you can have. I don't know how much time I still have, Terence.
No, it's okay. You should continue.
Perfect. So great. So here, it's very important to have, the right list of different actors engaged. And Guyana, compared to the global level, obviously Guyana is a rising country and developing country, but it's obviously not as established as, I said, Norway, or more, as financial stable as, I say, Qatar or others, in which, different countries where we operate, where you have already structure that are involved into investment, very much institutionalized. And there's a learning curve in Guyana that already, has been, with key progress, but you need to make sure that obviously national governments are there, but also, the sovereign wealth funds, other more, structural entities on the round table. Sectoral experts are brought in, academic voices, development operators, and the representative of the business ecosystems. All these have to be included into different platforms or engagement in terms of going from the revenue sharing financial structure to the actual trickling down in terms of where is the money disbursed, in terms of which mechanisms and others. And that's where I'm saying the actors have to be engaged. And in that case, there's been already quite a bit of work in Guyana. There's obviously different, it's a democratic country, for example, if you compare, in other regions at a very large micro level. But there's also been quite an engagement of different voices to try to help and support, mentor, Guyana into its course here. When you look then and understand the importance of this revenue sharing for the economic development and social welfare in Guyana, the importance of the oil is such, that it can actually really trickle through a series of training activities towards the development of business ecosystem. And that's where you go afterwards in terms of applying to yourself to Guyana Chandler, the financial and non-financial support through the right institutional backing with arbitrators, mediator, some kind of observers that can provide the kind of support through potential political change or others in the long run. So you have the institutional backing, you have kind of the epistemic communities and academic support to the model of development, and the implementation phase through a series of agreements between the oil company, but also other series of different actors that can be involved into this. And I don't know how much time I have to go in terms of the developing the fair and transparent revenue sharing work framework.
5 minutes.
Yeah, you can go for another 5 minutes.
Okay, perfect. So very, very interesting in terms of another 5, maybe 3 minutes, and then I'll try to wrap up my thoughts into this. When you look at what we're looking in terms of the fair and transparent revenue sharing, there's different approach to it. There's obviously development funds, and Guyana actually has a history of setting development funds and partnership with other countries, with Norway in terms of green development funds and others, and there's others that have been developed in terms of Guyana. But there's some best case practices that can be applied to actually trickling in terms of when we looked at equity partner. I mentioned Project Reconciliations, for example, which is a trust where indigenous communities in northern Alberta actually have a say in terms of the trickling down into key projects. That could be something very interesting to look at in terms of a micro budget, the participatory budgets. That is very interesting to look at. And then obviously the bulk of it needs to be agreed in terms of elements of economic diversification between government and all companies, in terms of how you trickle from a revenue sharing system towards much more of an applied plan and implementation of economic diversification through obviously some entities that are important for the oil developments. I mean, you need to be able to support it with onshore to its level of possibilities. I know offshore is much more important in Guyana as opposed to other countries, but ways of making sure that natural resources turns into a real success for Guyana through the development and implementation of those, training / economic diversification approach that leads towards as far as support to entrepreneurship in terms of key elements. And there's some very interesting methodologies here that can be applied from the mining sector. Sometimes the energy sector is a little bit, lagging in terms of those socioeconomic understanding and trickling of financial benefits to communities. The mining sector is sometimes more advanced. In Guyana, there are some cases. There's much more cases from Latin America and Europe and Canada on those elements that can be very much implemented in terms of turning from financial revenue sharing to actually trickling down to socioeconomic well-being and intergenerational equity and long-term sustainability, which is, I know, things that you're going to be focusing in the next sessions of discussions. Terence, I hope I'm not kind of eating on terms of things that you will discuss in the next few weeks, but those are really the key elements to it. Have a fair transparent revenue sharing agreement, which I know is in question and has been discussed in terms of Guyana, and Roger can actually explain the case of Trinidad and Tobago. But more importantly, understand that this is one element of the question. There's the entire non-financial and support to capacities, and the way that then you implement it through the right institutional backing down to the communities with a series of key methodologies that can serve as good best practices. I speak very fast and I have a terrible French accent, so I hope I didn't lose you along the way. But those are plenty of ideas for future thoughts, and I'm happy to pass you back the stage.
Thanks very much, Remy. You spoke very fast, but there was a lot of information to impart.
There's plenty more, as you can see, so I'll just probably keep it there.
But and I won't worry about your accent. You're perfectly comprehensible, and thank you very much for that.
I appreciate it.
Roger, if we might turn to you to pick up where Remy has left off, with some more specific examples from Trinidad and Tobago and implications for Guyana.
You're muted.
You're on mute, Roger.
You're mute. Let me unmute.
Okay.
You're good now.
Are you all hearing me?
Yes, we can hear you well, Raj.
I'm not seeing you all again. It just disappeared. Anyway, good morning, everyone.
Good morning to you.
Thanks for the invitation. Right, I think it's here, right? Thanks for the invitation. There was some kind of mix-up because I didn't know about this. I had queried the topic, and next thing I saw an email from Terence yesterday, and this was about 2 weeks ago. I had queried the topic. Anyway, we are here. So I have done a considerable amount of work in Guyana, reflecting on the Trinidad and Tobago situation and other such situations. I see the Guyanese economy ending up in having to be careful in terms of their labor market steps. Already their labor force participation rate is that will take some changing. I did a detailed look 2 years ago for one of the multilateral entities, outlined a series of the government of Guyana should take, and I'm not sure where that has reached. And I had this work on the stabilization fund for them about 5-7 years ago. I see some of it has been useful, some of it not useful. The Trinidad, from a revenue sharing perspective, that would be important for Guyana to consider. Now, what I had suggested to Lawrence Sobers and David Lewis is that before we get to revenues, we need the structure of production, the structure of labor, and the structure of trade. Now, I have reviewed many of these type of economies, what I call energy abundant economies, because of the Dutch disease and the effect of increase in amount of one factor. And Guyana has a lot of things in place to get it all wrong. Now, this doesn't mean that Guyana wouldn't get it all correct. So let me make sure the audience doesn't misquote me or mishear me. There's a lot of things in place in Guyana to get it all wrong. I am hoping, though, that with the resources that are flowing into Guyana, that they spend these resources and build up the institutions and work on their ease of doing business and design appropriate labor market strategy. Ensure that some of the things I'm already seeing in the labor market where it is drifting to a point of having a little a fall in the amount of skilled labor available and the amount of unskilled labor available as well, that they design some type of strategy probably benefiting from the Haitian labor that comes there and the Venezuelan immigrants that find themselves there in order to get things done. Now, taking a long way view of the trying to be revenue and not necessarily revenue sharing, we collected about $75 billion US in energy rents between 1962 and 2021. And the way the resources were used is of great concern to me. I have documented my position on this in many places. I've written a book with Palgrave and several research papers and whatnot on my concern with these matters. And I think that's where Guyana would have to be most careful. Now, what I like is right up front, Guyana has started a long-term smoothing process by having a stabilization fund, and I think they call it a natural resource fund, right up front in Guyana, and resources flow into that. I see lots of capital injections being made into the economy, and these capital injections, while some are generalized, must in relevant ways pay attention to the non-energy, non-tradable sector, where revenues have to be balanced in terms of collecting. And so, Remy and Riyad, I'm taking a sort of broad-based view where the revenues have to be collected is not from the energy sector in particular. You know, that's a given. That's a change in wealth from below the ground to above the ground that is going to be stored. And Guyana is trying a smoothing consumption process where they deal with the bird in hand and they manage the bird in hand. And that's going reasonably enough. What Guyana, in my view, has to be most careful about from a revenue collecting perspective is that the non-energy export sector, their rice sector and their sugar sector and the other sectors don't go the type of roads that are very, 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 very easy for them to reach. In fact, I don't want to pronounce and say that I see these things happening already in a formal way, but I have been looking at the Guyanese economy in terms of the IMF report and the IDB report that comes out quarterly, and I see numbers that leave me a little concerned. I see revenue figures in the non-energy sector that I think people like Terence and you all here must take a closer look at, because the rankings on the relevant international comparator indices, such as the transparency, the global transparency, the corruption perception index, the governance indices, the ease of doing business indices, all of those I looked at in the last week for Guyana, and the numbers are not the best. And so unless resources are plowed into fixing the institutions that could in turn help strengthen the focus on the non-energy export sector, then, and I'm assuming everybody here has some basic understanding of cricket, then we would end up in the type of scenario that the West Indies cricketing production function found itself in when Lara was making runs and some of the other batsmen were just losing their wickets. Not a good situation. And so my 2 cents contribution, and I would field questions and I did a PowerPoint, but it's not loading. I sent it to Terence. I don't know if you can load it. But my 2 cents contribution is that the strength of the Guyanese economy in the next 15 years is not the energy sector. The energy sector is a given and will generate all the resources to create the Guyana we want after 15 years. The strength of the Guyanese economies 15 years from this point is what and how they manage that energy resource to manage the structure of production, the structure of trade, and very, very, very importantly, the structure of employment, so that the non-energy, non-tradable sector, all these fancy malls and fancy buildings that we see going up and all those nice things, does not crowd out sectors that generate foreign exchange. We have seen this story, Remy, a million times. We know that it is the most dangerous, extensive highway open to the people of Guyana. And I say that my humble opinion is that Guyana will be the exception to the rule and not get it all wrong. So if the person changing his slide could go to slide 2. Thanks. So you would see this eventually happens in all countries. Guyana will get there. It may take 10, 15, 20 years in the context of global demand, in the context of the maturation of fields. This is Trinidad and Tobago. Next slide. We have produced a lot of oil cumulatively and gas, and yet still the economy today, these are not my numbers, these are IMF numbers. Sometimes people say I make up numbers in Trinidad, these are IMF numbers. So you see, and after 2022, we are still at a lower level of GDP than in 2006, although we have produced quite a bit of oil and gas. Next slide. And again, the Guyanese economy, I looked at it last week or week before, some work I'm doing for another multilateral, and they are ranked in the top 10 in terms of murders per capita, in terms of homicides per capita. And one of the things you want to do in developing your economy is not only get a high per capita GDP. Terence, anytime, once you give me the 5-minute notice, I will know how to plan the remaining slides.
No, you're good. You're good.
Okay, so these are the murders, and I think you could have a high per capita GDP, but you would be very uncomfortable in a setting like this. I certainly feel uncomfortable, and so the revenues.
Sorry, Roger, just to clarify, that's TNT, not Guyana.
Yeah, this is Trinidad and Tobago.
Right.
And
yeah, thank you.
And the revenues must be used to prevent in Guyana situations like this possibly emerging. Next slide. And you know the labor market, we have an aging population, we have a lot of people that are economically inactive. And I know the labor force in Guyana well. I have done a detailed assessment of it. And your labor force participation rate is even lower than Trinidad and Tobago. I think the only country that is lower than Guyana is Haiti. Whereas I think Guyana is about 53% of the non-institutionalized population participates in the labor force, whereas in the Bahamas, it's 72%. So you all have a long, long way to go in terms of using the revenues for training and whatnot. Next slide. And I mean, we have an age dependency situation in Trinidad, and the purchasing capacity of $100 has fallen. And I know in Guyana, the value of the currency in relation to the US dollar. So we need to keep building up supply side capacity and creating jobs, but not just any kind of jobs, long-term sustainable jobs, not hush money jobs, not raking at the side of the road where you start work 8 o'clock and finish 7:45. No. Sustainable long-term jobs that generate stable income. Next slide. And again, IMF data, not my data. You see the total GDP of the Trinidad and Tobago economy. It hasn't been doing very, very well. And there is a lot of work to be done. Next slide. The IMF recently made some modifications to Trinidad and Tobago GDP. And in fact, if you look at the forecasted level of GDP in 2023, it's about 5% lower than what was forecasted last year. So that's a lot of work to be done in Trinidad. Next slide. Our international reserves, Guyana would want, and that's one big advantage Guyana has. They started this natural resource fund right at the get-go. And you all need to keep building that up and building that up and building that up. So it becomes so big that the revenues, the investment income from it could help smooth capital expenditure in the economy and create long-term growth. If you all could ensure that takes place, Terence, Riyad, and Remy, that would be a big, big addition to the smoothing of consumption. The as Remy would tell you all, is the smooth consumption. I have spent 30 years of my life pursuing understanding of these type of energy-rich economies. And the real challenge, Remy, as you would know, is the smooth long-term consumption. This habit we have about spending out all the resources in one generation, especially in ethnically fractured states as Korea, and they would tell you all, coming out of Oxford, is the most dangerous win-vote strategy that could be applied. Next slide. And you have to watch that real exchange rate as a hawk. Watch it daily and ensure that it doesn't appreciate, because that's where the sting in the tail of energy revenues lie. Next slide.
That's why you have the resource curse, and then suddenly it's completely incompetitive.
Of course.
We have other sectors.
All the attendant problems. One of the main variables I look at for Guyana, if I look at the Guyanese economy, the first thing I look for is the really effective exchange rate. Yeah. In this slide here, well, you see we collected a lot of money, and Guyana is now walking that road. Next slide. Now, the Trinidad and Tobago economy has returned to growth. The Guyanese economy is growing. The growth will start to taper off after these surges in production in Guyana. After this year, one of the things you all want to look at, Remy, very closely is the ratio of non-energy, non-tradable production to non-energy tradable production. That's the second key variable I would identify for you all in terms of revenues. The first is the really effective exchange rate. The second is the ratio of non-energy, non-tradable to non-energy tradables. Because if you get it wrong, you would see revenues. But if you get it wrong, you would compromise the stock of reserves. And that's something you want to keep your eye on. Next slide. And of course, food prices. Now, Guyana has tremendous capacity to be the breadbasket of the Caribbean region, if not the Latin American region. What an energy boom would do is compromise your labor force in particular in the who wants to go and work in cocoa sugar when you could wait and do 2 or 3 day work in Exxon or one of the downstream supply companies and get 10 times the salary? You have to manage this with tremendous care. Otherwise, it could go wrong in that direction. Next slide. So these are just some of my questions and comments, Terence, that I pulled together last night when I saw your email. I tried to keep it as close to the revenue issue as I could, and I will try to attend whatever little questions come my way hereafter. Thank you for the time and thank you for the opportunity.
No, thank you. I think I'm glad I sent the email last night and you scrambled the rug, and I want to thank you so much for doing that, because I think the 2 presentations captured exactly what we were aiming at, sort of a high level understanding of this question of revenue sharing, and then in a sense some specificity that goes to, if I might,
Terence, before you get into
before I get there, yes, I wanted to go.
Let me just intervene here, because I think Roger's provided us with some very sobering data from TNT. Not a lot of what he said was much of a surprise to many of us, I would think, but that more from the anecdotal point of view. But he did provide facts and figures which would strengthen the argument for ensuring that Guyana does the right thing. I think the points made about labor market and skills shortage, the institutional framework, the importance of the non-energy tradable production aspect of diversifying the economy, and the need to build up the natural resources fund so that the investment income can underpin capital investment, development, and growth are all excellent points. I think that Remy also set the scene for the sort of general structure that the new economy should be taking, the general direction and the structure the new economy should be taking. In many ways, we're sort of skirting around the notion of what is the most applicable model for revenue sharing in Guyana. So I would like to invite our panelists to drill down a bit now and get into some specifics. But really, how do we balance short-term needs and gains with long-term sustainability and intergenerational equity? As our panelists and our audience would know, there's already a debate in Guyana about the concept and the importance of revenue sharing, with particular emphasis on how the population would benefit. And the debate goes from the concept of cash grants, handouts, as they are disparagingly called, to the notion of how you invest the resources in a sustainable economy, long-term growth, health, education, security, physical and social infrastructure, all these things that would guarantee long-term growth and intergenerational equity. So let's go back to Remy, please, and see if Remy can give us some specific pointers, and then we come back to Roger, and then Terence, I'll hand over to you to field the Q&A.
So that was quite a very interesting question, a very lengthy question in terms of trying to see, and that question is basically on the multiplicating factor of foreign investment in such a large sector as the oil and energy sector into inclusive development, economic development, in societal development in the country. And so it's obviously forging on infrastructure, looking at support to obviously non-energy and tradable goods. And thank you, Roger, actually again for kind of bringing it back on the reality of Guyana, the question of the rice sector and other production that are historical to Guyana that actually could that's where it would be a success or a failure, whether or not you see such strong, potentially strong sector that actually get embarked into a resource curse scenario of high inflation, high, currency prices and so on, exchange rate and then so on, bad exchange rate, so on. But yes, so how do you achieve this? I mean, whether you ask for the economists or the political scientists, or you're looking at elements of development expertise, you have a different answers. In terms of the economic element, it's obviously an element of having a fair agreement, and that is under discussions and scrutiny in Guyana, but being able in terms of financial resources to trickle it down. But then it's also looking at the mechanism, as I was making the point of making sure that you have the right kind of agreements with other cross-sectoral collaboration. The Devonshire Initiative, for example, has wonderful methodologies on this in terms of making sure that you can have partnership between sectors, and therefore making sure that these would be bundle in terms of their approach to kind of training needs, but also market approach and so on. I mean, in terms of Guyana, obviously it's a very very specific countries. It's not as developed in terms of energy services, but when you look at the capacities of other element in terms of other parts of the economy, you can actually have joint partnership in terms of sectoral elements. In terms of policies, it's obviously in terms of making sure that you have stability and you have a vision and traceability of how the money is used or the investment that are being made. So a very important element of ESG and the G in terms of ESG there, because of the importance of the sums that we're looking at in perspective for development. It's important that everyone has transparency and elements onto this, but you need to be able to showcase some success stories step by step. And I mentioned different methodologies from the mining sectors that are very relevant in terms of having approach to integrated development, inclusive development through elements of development of community suppliers and others. And so there's plenty of different tools. So that was a very lengthy answer, and I was saying defending of economists, political scientists, all the development practitioner, you have to take it from a different angle, that question.
Thanks, Remy. Roger?
Okay, thank you. In terms of how do we use these resources, I go back to being a core economist here, and really what you are asking me is how do we drift the production possibility frontier rightwards in a manner and form that ensures long-term growth and long-term sustainable growth. The key thing is sustainable growth. So the engine for economic transformation must be human capital formation. You must change the fabric of your primary school education, your secondary school education. Extremely critically is your tech work education and your tertiary education. In changing your tertiary education, I recommend you bind students. So two things. If you give free tertiary education, which I think you should, you don't give it for all sectors. You give it for sectors in alignment with a 10-year plan for economic growth in the non-energy sector and in alignment, and also you bind them with a contract so that you cannot take the education and just leave Guyana and go and work somewhere else and Guyana carries the bill and you all say thank you. No, those days have to come to an end. You leave the country, you pay back the loan at the commercial rate of interest. That's something that you all would have to do because now Guyana is labor starved. The second thing is this mention of cash grants. Stay extremely far away from it as possible, in my view. To keep it as far away as possible, except in where you could help the very poorest and most vulnerable. Now, those things have a tendency, Terence, in ethnically fractured society, and it's very important to read the work of Paul Collier coming out of Oxford and those type of people. There's another gentleman by the name of Raja Hussein in Trinidad and so on. You should read some of the things that he has said, and you do not engage these cash grants willy-nilly. You do it in a careful, scientific, minimalist way. Why? Because the unemployment rate is also closely linked to poverty, and Guyana will drift very close to full employment, so that the need to augment cash grants into the system would fall. And if you push cash grants and you push transfers, you are going to create a backward bending labor supply curve, and there all the dynamics for failure would continue. So you need to be very, very careful of that. Of course, you would need to build up your infrastructural base so you could open up underutilized areas of economic resources and bring them into fuller and more meaningful use. And so, but it must be done in an intelligent, careful way that you take a layered approach and you bring those blocks of resources into use that give you the most value added. I understand there is, or you always correct me, the possibility of a road, that a highway to go to Brazil, and that's going to explode economic activity if it's properly managed. And Guyana may now want to consider a partial scope agreement with Brazil. And what you all should do is you all should look at use something like WITS or one of the databases and calculate the potential welfare impact of a partial scope agreement with Brazil and the items in which you all have potential comparative advantage in and export potential, and do this thing in a hardcore scientific way that the people of Guyana benefit from the minimization of wastage and the maximization of things on the upswing of the international product cycle. And the opportunities are boundless. I feel like I'm talking too much, so let me just stop there. Sorry.
No, I think you're not talking too much. I think you're hitting, and you guys are hitting exactly the questions. I mean,
I think though we already have a partial scope agreement in place with Brazil. The question is how it's operationalized, and obviously there is a framework, but the opening up of trade between West Brazil and Guyana in particular is going to be an important element in our future development.
What I may say to you, Riyad, at this point is if you could make a note to whoever is the relevant person that could take these things back to the line authorities, is to do a trade can deep dive analysis. So when you engage a partial scope, you look particularly for missed opportunities and rising stars. That's where Guyana will get the most foreign exchange from. So whoever could point that out to the relevant authorities, consider thanks.
It's true. It's actually an interesting idea. I mean, you're arriving to a level of developments and initiatives that have already been taken in Guyana, in the sense that you can see, those that have been, successful, the kind of front runners of initiative that actually can hold promises towards generating, income and others, and initiative in terms of different sectors, their reactivity to some of the policies that were taking in place. That means that they are able to ramp up in terms of the new generation of public policy towards sustaining development economic actors. So at this point right now, we're not talking, Guyana in 2019 or even before. We've seen already some implementation of policies. It could be a good moment to actually do this survey of trying to see who is responding well in terms of seeing the way to be able to engage with the initiative taken and having a future, and can be kind of case studies and pilots. Because when you're arriving, if I may, but in different jurisdictions or countries, and we work a lot, and we're based in Qatar, and we worked a lot on terms of Qatarization, economic diversification of different countries. We do quite a bit in East Africa also. When you're looking at countries where there is a gap in terms of the ecosystem and business ecosystem, there needs to be regular mentorship, and there need to be also a series of success stories, even in the first couple of steps, to be able to kind of generate some impetus and momentum for others to follow suit. So it's kind of supporting and being benevolent kind of institutional backing to this progress of the economy. Like we all faculty, we have the same thing in classrooms. And I think that's kind of the idea, to showcase a best example and replicate it among different subsectors or different initiatives, and be able to arrive into a sustainable and indigenous way of developing the future of the Guyanese economy. So I kind of going beyond probably the scope of that.
No, this is an extremely interesting conversation, and it hits on the head. I mean, there have been a number of questions. I want to start with one for Roger Hussein. You've noted that the cumulative sort of energy rents is about 75 billion for Trinidad and Tobago, and in part, this is what kind of motivated this kind of discussion, because there was a Rystad study which suggested that the cumulative rents would be of the order of $150 billion, probably inflated. But key to this was this question of the sovereign wealth fund and how one would ensure. So the question for you is a question for Roger Hussein: why has Trinidad and Tobago failed to build up a sovereign wealth fund like Mark? That would have been the best. So what is it? Fractured ethnic? What is it that caused Trinidad to not build up? And maybe there's a follow-up there.
Yeah. So, I could only answer as an academic. Politicians would obviously give a different style of answer. In ethnically fractured societies, and the worst kind is when you have two main ethnicities. That's the most difficult. The election races are close, and that makes Trinidad and Tobago and Guyana very similar in that regard. There is a strong urge to spend resources so that you remain in control of the national coffers. So the next election in Guyana, for example, there are going to be a lot, and I'm going to be guessing here, of promises that's going to be coming to the table by both parties in order to try to remain in control of this massive amount of economic wealth that is going to flow through the economy. And the reason that we didn't have, or we don't have, a larger HSF fund is, in my understanding of the facts, we spent a lot of money on transfers and subsidies, much more at times than we earned on energy revenues, and therefore, in order to maintain some degree of political power, we got the fiscal wrong. And I am saying, or suggesting to Guyana is, and again, you all have this tremendous advantage of having the natural resource fund right up front. Our HSF came into being in 2008, and the sun was turned on the LNG plants in Trinidad, I believe in 1995 or 1996, and a lot of FDI, and then production started in 1999. So you all have a good head start in that regard. So be careful about the promises made to inflate transfers. Be careful about the promises made that could skew labor force to work towards the government. The government shouldn't become too heavily involved in the economy and absorb labor and enter into active competition for labor with the private sector. So, and I'm not only giving a Trinidad and Tobago answer here. I'm very familiar with the international literature, and as much as possible, I'm referring you to the international literature. So that's where it gets wrong. But the worst case, Terence, is when you only have two ethnic groups. That's where the fighting for the rents in terms of pressure groups is greatest. And you all know the story. I mean, I don't have to convince people like you all here from Guyana as to how that could unfold. It's there. It needs tight management, and where possible, you all seek the guidance of the IMF. Where possible, seek the guidance of the IMF. So you get some independent, highly technical economists to help counsel you so that you stay within certain perimeters.
Yeah, so I want to just follow up on that. And this is a question, just it's occurring every single day. So the question is, economists have described what, in order to have a little balance in terms of the equity, in order for the poor people in Guyana to feel somehow that they're involved in this game, what can we do from the economic perspective tomorrow? And that's the question. Tomorrow. So you've ruled out, in a sense, the universal basic income type model, because and I think you raise a very important point. That is an extreme challenge to do something like that within the context of a society like Guyana, given its history of ethnic tension and lack of trust and lack of cohesion in some aspects. So, but it still remains that we, I think, need to think more creatively about, is there something that we can do so that the folks who the rents are not trickling through too? And so the question is there some technical thing that we need to do? Because the kind of question that emerges is the sort of question that emerges here, because the sense is that this is not working as well as it ought to be working, and so that's the thought. So first, the follow-up for you, Roger, and then for Remy, just thinking through this question of, is the revenue sharing agreement an unfavorable one? If it is, to what extent is it unfavorable? And then what are the mechanisms that are in place for the government to begin to at least come to a more equitable revenue sharing agreement in the broad sense as you described?
So, good question, very good question. And obviously there would be ways and slow interventions that you could consider to help directly target poor people. And that's totally on the radar. You don't want to take that off your radar at all. You have your social workers go into the community and you help the poorest and most vulnerable where you can. But nothing would create long-term growth for these people like education, opportunities for women in education in particular, for girls, rural girls in particular, developing the infrastructural base. Remember, as the unemployment rate goes down over time, that would benefit everyone. As you help improve the education of girls, that would benefit everyone. What I would say is that what Guyana wants to be particularly careful about is to create a situation which is similar to a dole. You don't want to affect your labor force work ethic. You want to keep your labor force work ethic intact, and that's why the long-term interests of Guyana is best served by a bigger sovereign wealth fund, or the sovereign wealth fund becoming larger and larger, and use the interest income from that to help where possible with the targeted subsidies. And I think, to manage a little is difficult, to manage plenty is even more difficult. But you all could seek consultation, seek relevant guidance, focus on education, as I said, in a very detailed, big way, focus on rural people, make sure that the your institute, I think it's called the National Institute of Statistics, or your statistical institute, is well resourced, because without that data, it would be difficult to make decisions. And I use the Statistical Institute data all the time. And there are little gaps here and there, and you all need to get those gaps closed so that the information asymmetry disappears. And when you make interventions, you make it with hardcore data. So be wary of the large-scale transfers. Do it on a targeted basis and educate your people into long-term sustainable development, and create jobs by opening up the right type of parks in the right type of areas that Guyanese people benefit. And when it is needed, augment the labor force under a proper, well-structured labor management strategy, because you can't run Guyana with 700,000 people. Either you ask 300,000 people from the diaspora to come back some May, or you look for another 500,000 people in the region and elsewhere, because you would need it over the next 10 years. So you need to plan from now.
Yeah, thanks. So Remy, as you aim it, so this question about, so integrate into your response around
I will. First of all, I second a lot of what Roger said in terms of what's needed in Guyana, and I would have loved to rebound on several of those points. Some good question on there in terms of making sure that you all benefit from that reserve. This question on Andre mentions what is the best approach for government to renegotiate an informal production sharing agreement. There've been discussions on this and on whether or not it's unfavorable. I understand the debate on this. I'm not a lawyer myself, so I won't be able to explain what is the track. The objective here, I think, is to focus on outside of this agreement what could be real effective actionable development actions for the country in itself. So those are two different questions, but I understand the concerns obviously that is raised onto this when you compare in terms of benchmark and others. But the reality in terms of what will make the future of Guyana is the capacity to attract the diaspora's investment into some diversified assets in Guyana and production that will make sure that that there is continuous development, stability, and not fall too much, because it will be the case in terms of the resource curves. There's scenario disease elements here. On the other elements, which is from the perspective of the operator, ExxonMobil or others, I mean, you're looking at findings in Guyana and other parts of the region that makes it much obviously very relevant to have key transparency and key agreement. If there needs to be renegotiations or other more elements moving away from that contract towards more implementation of other budgets, for example, there is a real need and cases for de-risking the assets into the mid to long range in terms of ensuring the sustainable development in Guyana for the next several decades. Because if not, reputational costs, the kind of case that we'll make against it, and we've seen some cases in Angola, in Mozambique, in other places, even in Mozambique, the rise of Daesh insurgency was not the fault of Exxon or Total Energies, but that showed that the continuously flourishing economy around a project is essential for the valuation of the investment itself. And therefore all the cases that I made just before, and I don't want in terms of having the right mechanism, the right approach, the kind of integrated approach to training, to local performance, sustainable social budgets and performance, and including large parts of the population, not only kind of the first circles of employees offshore, and kind of is very important towards the value of the asset itself and the social license that goes with it, which actually makes the world different. So I hope I kind of made the bridge between what Roger was saying and kind of answered Andre's question on the renegotiations and trying to go beyond this in terms of actually going towards a conciliation and real dedication to the future of Guyana.
So there's also an issue that arises around the relationship between Guyana, Trinidad, Suriname, and Venezuela. So Michael's thinking about the contrast of our policy, but I want to ask if both of you could sort of just weigh in on the relation. So Guyana, Trinidad, Suriname emerging, and Venezuela in this energy sector, and what are some thoughts that folks ought to be considering in this context?
Do you want me to go first?
I'm more than happy to give the honors.
What I would say is when you mention Suriname, Guyana, and Trinidad and Tobago in the same sentence, what comes to my mind is CARICOM. I sit at COTED, so I am not speaking on behalf of COTED here, nor on behalf of the University of the West Indies. I'm speaking on behalf of myself. What comes to mind is a strategy by which the non-CARICOM countries could now benefit from the surge in economic activity in Guyana, the expected surge in economic activity in Suriname, and a moderate increase in economic activity in Trinidad and Tobago. Now, as we all know, most of these other non-energy CARICOM countries, they have a stuttering economic growth, high debt levels, and therefore they need persistent current account imbalances. If you have Guyana next door, which you know in the next 10 years, GDP is going to move from alpha to beta significantly higher, then it is critical to do a simulation and understand how it is Guyana's GDP is going to change, how it is the structure of Guyana's import with this change in per capita GDP is going to change, what Guyana can do to competitively import substitute given the change in the structure of their income and hence the structure of their imports, and what non-energy producing CARICOM countries can do to benefit from the change in the structure of imports in Guyana. The problem in CARICOM is these things to me are the very basic steps, just like Chanda Paul just pushing forward and making a single. You have to
We can't
follow
say Chanda,
we don't do it. So I would be surprised if I would like to see, let me put it this way, that the relevant authorities do these basic steps that could put CARICOM on the right roadmap, that could create real, very, very low-hanging fruit opportunities for the non-energy CARICOM exporting countries, and also for the import substituting potential of Guyana, which you could calculate. You could calculate what are the top 20 industries in which import demand is going to rise, and therefore in which Guyanese businessmen should build technological parks or other type of business parks and manufacture certain type of products for which the import demand would be high, but now produce it in Guyana. You could work these things out. But what tends to happen in an energy boom? You know, Gilles Baudin said in 1564, he said, and I hope that this doesn't apply to Guyana, men, and I quote, men of a fat and fertile soil are most often effeminate and coward, whereas contrariwise, men of a barren soil are by nature vigilant and industrious. I urge the Guyanese people, Chanda Paul is a son of the soil, to design policy like Chanda Paul making 100, slow but steady and consistent. And I think you all would get there. The ball is in your court. The wicket is playing well, but there's a lot of homework to be done by the Guyanese people from an import competing perspective, a substituting perspective, by the CARICOM people to see the opportunities in Guyana, Suriname, and Trinidad and Tobago. The question is, who is going to put the bell around the cat and ensure it gets done?
Remy?
Don't forget that Chanda Paul has a 69 ball century.
I know that.
I was just about to remind him that Chandra Paul could beat the ball too. So I'll just got, well, anyway, I don't want to take it down the cricket road. Remy?
Yeah, it's hard like to follow, but just to conclude on this, and obviously you make some very good points, Roger, in terms of import substitution, the role of a original level of analysis there. There needs to be collaboration between countries. Competition is always part of it, but obviously you don't. There's been a history of relationship between Guyana and Trinidad. There's been specific case in Guyana, Suriname. So it's interesting to look at there from different angles. Yes, the import substitution at the regional level makes a lot of sense on different aspects, especially when you actually drill it down to Guyana. It's very important for the operator of the Stabroek to actually be cautious about creating local content at different levels, especially at the local level. And that's actually can be also on the subnational level and different aspects. So that's where it needs to be very well strategized. And I agree with you, Roger, and what you were saying, and the role of diaspora is obviously essential there. I don't know how you want me to conclude on this, Terence. I know you want us to move forward, but I'm happy to continue discussing.
I'm looking at the clock, and we've already. I know we've gone through the hour really, really quickly. There's still quite a few questions left in the, but I don't want to impose on the time beyond too much beyond the hour. But maybe if I could just ask one more question that has arisen here, is of a technical nature, so I'm not immediately sure, and then we'll ask Riyad to kind of give some summing up thoughts, and then I think we'll say thank you and close. So this one, I suppose, maybe for Raja, and actually, Raja, I wanted to ask you one question. I noted this Rybczynski and reverse Rybczynski. So I don't know if you could weave this into just a little sort of give the audience a little sense of, you know, what the Rybczynski theorem is and why it might have some applications to.
Okay, so Rybczynski theorem is really has to do with the impact of an increasing factor of production on the productive structure of an economy. So as Guyana, oil is more of a commodity, but gas is more of a factor of production. As Guyana produces more gas, it would lead likely to an increase in the amount of gas-intensive goods that Guyana produce. Who knows? Maybe you all may think about, apart from generating electricity, you all may think about going into ammonia production or methanol production or urea production or some kind of production linked specifically to natural gas, which you all should. And the reverse, the Rybczynski effect is influenced by the increase in the factor of production, and whereas you have labor and other factors of production flowing into the sector that intensively uses the booming factor of production. And the reverse Rybczynski is just the opposite of that, where it flows out. Now, I think Guyana would not have to worry about the Rybczynski effect too much, because you all are going to be dominated much more by Dutch disease concerns. I mean, I don't want to sound any alarm bells, and I could, we could always talk about this in a proper longer-term seminar face-to-face if we could work something like our Terrence. But some of the numbers I see about Guyana, which I monitor once every 7 days, point me in the direction of concern. But, you don't want to raise that in an hour-long seminar without being able to defend it. What I would say is that you all need to keep having these seminars, keep educating the people. Sometimes it may not make you popular. Sometimes people may say, you all are pointing things out that are far-fetched and that are not relevant. You will get some stick sometimes. I think I have seen it 100 times, Remy, where we say these kind of things, the road is there, and the country takes exactly the road that they shouldn't take. And I'm being clear each time I say that to say that Guyana could probably be the exception. But I am saying to you all that we need to look carefully at that labor market. Already it is starting to show some signs of a skewed distribution. We need to look at the production function. Already it is starting to show some skewed signs. And in particular, you need to look at the structure of fiscal expenditures. Already it is starting to show some skewed signs. It is not a dramatic change, but you all need to be looking at them now and pointing them out to the policymakers to try to see if where it is possible, you hold the progress and even better reverse it. So that would be my closing comment. I hope it was useful. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Remy?
No, I mean, what you're saying in terms of the macro elements and the evolution of the labor market, the distortion is absolutely true. You're seeing, those trends and tendencies. So you made the right light in terms of the economic angle to it. What I'm saying is, maybe to complement to it is a little more on the institutional and political aspect to it, making sure that you have the right kind of, mechanisms to potentially disperse, incentives, target correctly the right incentives, that one that supporting sectors that will be obviously suffering from the resource curse, the increase of potential monetary pressures and others, and make sure that you actually have a clear vision of what are the stakeholders with whom to engage, key success stories in terms of entrepreneurship, support to entrepreneurship, to motivate kind of a general. It's not only kind of marketing. It's also very important to kind of provide some examples and lessons learned, deeply, and mentoring those different parts of subsectoral levels. That will be very important to ensure economic diversification, which is in the best interest of both the operator excellent and the government, obviously, and the population, which hopefully will be the key to any kind of discussion about renegotiating a contract, whichever tries focus on this also at the same time, because that's where I actually make success stories or failures, and then we've seen much more failures than success stories around the world in terms of being able to manage sustainably a resource fund such as the oil sector. So that was a large grasp, but that you see where I'm going.
No, I think you've given me the perfect pitch to Riyadh. Riyadh, a partnership with the operator as the mechanism, as the road to sustainable development. You get the comment on the last word.
Well, I think it's a bit of a challenge to try and sum up such a rich discussion, but there are some key takeaways. To ensure economic diversification and long-term growth, uh, a few of the elements that are important, and certainly to avoid the collapse that we've seen in Venezuela, as Ambassador Michael Skoll raised in his question. We need to be looking at the experiences of our close neighbors and countries further afield. Venezuela is an obvious example of a country we don't want to emulate. Roger has given us some examples from Trinidad and Tobago, which we should be very concerned about. And we need to build our capacity. We need to transform the workforce by transforming the education system from primary to tertiary and tech voc. We need to ensure that the students that are trained remain in the country. We need a managed migration and labor policy to be implemented. We will have to import labor, and the sooner we do that, the better. But we need to identify the skills shortages. I believe the government has already gone some way towards doing that, and I seem to recall that a study was promised in the short to medium term, or the results of the study would be made public at some point. In terms of cash grants, that's a big no-no apparently, unless it's done in a scientific way and that the most vulnerable benefit. But we need to avoid the curse of transfers and subsidies on a widespread scale. And as Roger said, we need a scientific and methodological approach to the issue. We need to look at the application of sound economic theory to be applied to the political economy. And in that respect, we do need all the expertise that is available from the multilateral investment, the multilateral financial institutions, and friendly governments. And also, we can benefit from our CARICOM sister states. And with all this, if we can guarantee Guyana's own sustainable development, we can underpin the sustainable development of the CARICOM region. And one last point, the Natural Resources Fund, the Sovereign Wealth Fund, is going to be a key element in the way that the investment income can be used to underpin capital investment and growth. I don't think I've done justice to everything that our panelists said, but I'd like to thank Roger and Remy for sharing their very insightful thoughts with us. And thanks, Terence, for the opportunity to be part of this. And thanks to our audience for listening in.
Thank you, Riyad. Thank you, Terence. Yes, also.
Thank you all very much. It's been a really wonderful discussion. As you can see, the folks on Facebook think that it was a truly rich discussion. There was still more questions. The role of culture in this oil-rich economy, but I suppose we will have to come back and have some more discussion in this regard. I take away from this as a mathematician. I take away from this the importance of the human capital formation as really an essential driver for this long-term sustainability. And I also think that the sovereign wealth fund, and I think I would hope that at some point in the near future, we will do something that just focuses on the sovereign wealth fund, because I do think that there are some opportunities there that we perhaps are not taking as effectively as we ought to at this moment. Having said that, this is the first one for the second season, and it's been great. You guys have given us a really great kickoff here, and I look forward to seeing you again on the second Wednesday of every month. And I want to thank Riyad for being so gracious in filling in for David. And I hope that maybe you will do it more frequently if the opportunity arises. And I've read your bio, Raja Hussein, and I read, obviously I looked at some of your work online, and I'm quite happy to have met you. You're even more blunt talking than and Remy. Again, thank you for providing us this sort of platform on which to build a conversation. It was deeply appreciative, and I want to thank you guys all and say good afternoon. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.